A pleasure to meet all at last. And so, I feel like that it's about time for me to go ahead and wrap things up. Today it is the November 30th. The 30th of November. Tomorrow from now, we got ourselves one more month left of 2024 to deal with, and some things might get a bit chaotic. Because it'll be the holidays, obviously. Before I do all that though, why don't we go on ahead and talk about one last film here, as this is the 68th episode. And knowing that it's been 6 months since I started the series here, this particular season has carried on for quite a while. I've had a lot of new films to talk about, and plenty of other stuff. But now comes the time to wrap things up. We're going to go on ahead and talk a bit about Disney's Dinosaur. Yep, this was the film in the year 2000 in which it starred a young iguanodon raised by lemurs and then carried over to the deserts of the certain nesting grounds. A paradise that, of course, would be seen as the next hope for the surviving groups of dinosaurs. But before a number of things would carry out, we might as well talk a bit about the film itself. The cast, for the most part, did have some voices here and there, some of which weren't all that memorable. Maybe D.B. Sweeney, whom is in fact the voice of the main protagonist, Alidor the Iguanodon. And then of course there come by other voices here and there, some of which I haven't remembered all too well, but a few that I know for some ways: Joan Plowright, Della Reese, Peter Siragusa, and Samuel E. Wright, just to name a few. Even certain guest stars, if you will: Evan Sabara, Millie West, Darren Norris, Frank Welker, and even Jeff Fisher. Yeah, the same Jeff Fisher who would eventually become famous for the character Jeff Fisher in American Dad. Who would have thought? Jeff Fisher plays Jeff Fisher. Yeah, but this was a while before then. 5 years, to say the least. And in terms of the overall plot, well, it's a pretty interesting pick. Something that I have remembered for a pretty long time. In this instance, a young iguanodon, whom at first is in the nesting grounds of iguanodon species, basically with his own kind. But however, a certain young Parasaurolophus wanders off into the forest and comes across a pretty frightening sight. And I know what you're thinking. It's got to be some kind of dinosaur that we know about. One in particular that 7 years prior hit center stage. Box office wise, allowed for Universal and Steven Spielberg to win big in '93. Well, unfortunately for Disney's Dinosaur, it's no T-Rex. No. This was in fact a 1984 discovery known as Carnotaurus. Yeah. Basically, this South American theropod, while not at all as formidable as T-Rex, as it's barely much bigger than that of the average person, was in fact beefed up and even given some unique armor and larger horns, just so it could appear intimidating and ferocious as a threat to iguanodon kind. In fact, the one Carnotaurus that sprawls out of the woods and runs towards the iguanodons causes them, as well as other dinosaurs like Styracosaurus, to run off into the distance. And while not all of them make it out alive, even more so knowing that the Carnotaurus did trample over some of the eggs that were stored on the grounds themselves, one thankfully survives. And well, while this one originally was meant to stay there until it finally hatched, and unfortunately doesn't. Small scavengers come around, little guys to say the least. They pick up the egg gets carried around by flying creatures, eventually ending up in a lush rainforest, which is mainly inhabited by lemurs. The lemurs come across the egg then hatches, and out comes a baby iguanodon, whom they name Alidor. Yeah, it's that classic cliche in which that a baby happens to be carried out of danger in a certain way. I mean, you ever seen Dragon Ball, Prince of Egypt, or even The Legend of Spyro? Yeah, this is kind of like that. Except it's an egg with the dinosaur inside. It's not a baby in a carriage of some sort. None of that stuff. Yeah. It seems to be a common thing to this day. However, in spite of all that, and in spite of Aladar making some not so pleasant first impressions on the lemur family, which consists of certain members like Pleo and Yar, whom of course are the parents of a few children, and many other members of lemur kind inside this rainforest, Aladar would in fact grow up to be his own self. It's not like how in other franchises they were led to believe to be something different. Nah, they kind of just allow Aladar to see himself as a different creature. Yeah. A fully grown iguanodon is what we eventually get to see, but not before a certain game takes place, and a little frightening note. Yeah, one would think that the iguanodon would be capable of swallowing the lemurs, but instead, we get a pretty funny moment in which Aladar ends up spitting out. Yeah. He spits out his own siblings, if you will. But let's be real here. Apart from all the things that came around, we do have some pretty impressive moments here. I mean, we have the little baby down the river cliche. We have ourselves a fully grown iguanodon who knows who he is and that he doesn't really feel much different. I mean, he after all came out of nowhere back in the day before he hatched. And the lemurs did raise him almost like he was one of their own. And while he did technically have a different lifestyle and a different diet, the rainforest was more than enough to accommodate his dietary needs. I mean, there was a lot of plants everywhere, if you couldn't already tell. Anyways, though, some time passes before eventually we get to see more stuff happen. You know, we get some dialogue exchange between the different characters. We get to know about the likes of the lemur family as well as Aladar himself pretty well. We get to see them gaze up at the sky on their own island, until eventually comes a point in time where certain danger comes around. Yeah, a fireball, as it's dubbed by the characters, comes down and causes a massive wipeout to occur. Yeah, the island itself becomes engulfed in the explosive wake, forcing Aladar and the lemurs to jump off for safety into the water below. And while they almost don't make it out of there, thankfully, Aladar and the lemur family, Pleo, Yar, and whatnot, they are able to get out of there in one piece. And when they wash up ashore, they find out that the rest of the lemurs are gone. Yeah, so not a great way to start things off here. I mean, this here is a movie where things seem different for one iguanodon, and this iguanodon is now forced to leave his only home that he's known for his whole life, along with what's left of his own family. Surrogate or whatnot, these were people that he had come to care about. And he had also been known as a kind, generous, and playful type of individual, despite being way larger and possibly more predatorial in a way to the other lemurs. But being a herbivore, he obviously desired not to eat them. Anyways, though, a certain desert wasteland is where the group eventually travels to, encountering a certain herd being led by a few other dinosaurs. These dinosaurs, of course, are similar in characteristics to what Aladar is like. Even a female iguanodon appears named Nira. And yeah, this was a while before the Nira from Planet 51, but again, there's plenty of different people I'm sure that it might be called Nira. Anyways, though, there are two, in fact, iguanodons that are quite similar in a way to Aladar, two herbivore predators, and many other unique species. Even a Brachiosaurus has accompanied the group. A small Ankylosaurus is also with them. But many other species of herbivore dinosaurs, for the most part, are with them, with the predators mostly being out of sight, though some groups, including the smaller raptors, do seem to be stalking them about, trying to pick off the weaker pieces of the herd before things start to get ugly for them. After all, any of those herbivores could possibly put them on the ground and stop them, or even worse. In terms of how the herd is grouped together, like I've said, there was a female iguanodon named Nira, and she herself has a brother named Crone, whom is in fact the leader of the herd himself, and even has a lieutenant named Bruton. Both of these dinosaurs, alongside Nira and the rest of the herd, are in fact on their way to a certain promised land called the breeding grounds, or the nesting grounds as they dub to it. However, in terms of the paradise itself, it's quite a distance away. And with Crone and Bruton's guidance, they supposedly are able to get there within the span of a number of days, though not quite specified and not quite thorough enough to allow the rest of the herd to be comfortable with the long and somewhat tedious and brutal journey on the way there. It becomes a sort of Oregon Trail-like thing that takes place. Loads of problems are going to end up taking place. Weather should change, dietary and hydration needs will change. Eventually there comes the point where there could probably be a mutiny or uprising in effect. And of course the constant danger of the predators around and the surrounding environment. Because remember, there's mostly deserts around the area that they're traveling in. And it's not necessarily the best thing to be around in. This kind of situation is something nobody wants to endure. But it is pretty much what it is. They are on their way to a certain paradise that awaits them. And it's a while before they end up getting there. Aladar, of course, joins them along with the lemurs, and in fact, does get acquainted with some of the other dinosaurs. Mainly hanging out in the back with the likes of Baleen, a brachiosaur, Ema, a styracosaur, as well as Earl, a small ankylosaur, whom is, in fact, portrayed by Frank Welker. So who would have thought? Of course, we certainly can't go very far without mentioning the fact that Aladar and the back do seem to, in fact, notice danger upon them. Not just with the raptors, but when they happen to get to a point where they need to find water, it gets pretty bad. Because there's no water in the area. And at the point where Aladar is actually able to find water, it's because he presses his hoof into the ground. And it's a unique technique that he puts together. We also should mention that Nira happens to have children. Smaller dinosaurs that accompany the group just as well happen to be mostly young that she intends to raise, along with some of the others whom themselves have children of their own. And while Aladar and the lemurs are in fact a bit small, and the same thing can go with some of the other dinosaurs arguably speaking, the journey itself still does not seem that much better for the smaller folk, as they too could get picked off by any of the predators. But we really ought to get started on the real trouble that does kick in shortly after the water is discovered, thanks to Aladar's help. You know, dinosaurs are able to enjoy a nice drink and a small break that Crone and Bruton do allow. But of course, Crone eventually does allow for a scouting mission to take place, with Bruton being the main guide, and a few others would also accompany him. Unfortunately, it gets pretty hairy. Remember the Carnotaurus? There's two of them now. Two of them that happen to have come pretty far north, which is not quite usual of these species in particular. Remember, the Carnotaurus was originally in South America back in the day, being discovered in 1984. A lot of landmass had changed since they went extinct over 66 million years ago, and tons of other things had gone down. Over the course of millions of years, obviously with tectonic plates shifting, and with very slow bilateral movements within the land masses that occupy the tectonic plates themselves, chances are, in a few millennia, the United States could end up in a completely different shape. And the same thing could go with plenty of other areas around the world. But anyways, to avoid getting off track, the Carnotaurus are officially caught up to the rest of the herd. and mostly because of Bruton's scouts being picked off by them, while Bruton himself barely escapes. He's able to warn Krone, they sound off, allowing the herd to get up and moving, and while Baleen, Ema, and the others in the back don't do such a good job catching up, even with Aladar's help, it just seems all they can do is just rely on luck for the rest of the way. Another big part comes around, though, where Aladar and the others end up separated. A small cave eventually caves in on them, as they would basically make their way out through the valley nearby in the hopes that they could find the breeding grounds easily. However, the nesting grounds don't quite seem as accessible to them in spite of this little discovery that they put together. And even more so, they try to take refuge in the caves nearby, and one rainy night, the Carnotaurs just so happen to find them out and about. Thankfully, Bruton is able to come across and beat the Carnotaurs, just barely saving Aladar from getting taken away and eaten up. However, it doesn't fare much better, because the cave itself collapses, crushing Bruton to death, along with one of the Carnotaurs, while the other one is able to get out of there. Thankfully through the entrance, as on the other side, there was Aladar, Baleen, Ema, and some others. They were trapped in a certain segment of the cave, and while Aladar seems like he's going to give up, the others basically remind him that he is responsible for getting them this far. And for him to turn back all of a sudden doesn't seem like Aladar, at least from what we know. With great difficulty in such a dire situation, though, comes great strength. And as Baleen demonstrates, as well as the rest, even Aladar eventually becomes inclined that he must carry on, as he did bring himself up to allow this group to survive. And with Bruton's sacrifice, they just might have a chance to not only escape this little predicament, but also find out what lies ahead. With enough effort made, they do manage to allow the wall to collapse, and the rocks do allow a light to be shed. And when that light is fully encased in their eyes, they are able to see clearly the nesting grounds. Yep, the valley, the caves, it all adds up here. After all, with the usual route that the group was heading through, the herd actually didn't realize that, well, as Ema herself discovers, after a few moments are spent frolicking around, jumping in the lake and whatnot, that apparently there was a massive landslide. Aladar learns that the usual route to get to the nesting grounds would not have been possible to cross without any possible death or injury. He decides to head back the way he came and proceed onward through the usual route, where the herd was in fact heading, as Krone and Nero were still leading the group, without Bruton's assistance. After all, Krone even did advise to Bruton that he could feed the Carnotaurs with his own hide if he had to. Yeah. Talk about a somewhat barbaric leader who disregards the safety and welfare of the group, but also just blatantly allows for his own right-hand lieutenant to just perish at the hands of two Carnotaurs. Two predators that likely could have been defeated with the herd's combined effort. But that's just a bit of a personification here. A statement that actually will come into play very soon. Because once Aladar does get back, warns the group that the other Carnotaur is on its way to them after figuring out that they were actually trying to cross over this landslide just to make it to the other side, which would not have been possible. Yeah. He once again goes at Krone after the last time that it happened. Yeah. Unlike the last time, it was about getting the back dinosaurs, which included Nira and Ema and Baleen and whatnot. They all had to get moving, but Krone was definitely more of a hurry than you might expect. And he was not playing games with Aladar then. In this instance, though, he interferes with the herd a second time. Aladar obviously was more than cautionary and correct about his statements. He had been to the valley, he had gone out into the caves, but in all seriousness, Kron was once again not in the mood. He decides to challenge Aladar, a fight to the death in a way. And surprisingly, even Nira was not happy about this. In fact, she decides to betray her own brother in favor of allowing Aladar to take leadership of the group and allow for them to take a safer route to lead to the nesting grounds, completely ignoring Kron's demands. Obviously, Kron is mad, especially devastated at his own sister betraying him. But even then, after being defeated, he just simply decides to carry on the way he was hoping to do so. However, they weren't out of the mess just yet, because the Carnotaur is there, just as Aladar had stated. And man, is it menacing. It might as well just be a terrifying, large predator, which certainly is out of scale, as Carnotaurs weren't exactly big, bulky, or giant, and they also didn't have many spines decorating their backs, along with those large of horns. Real life, of course, paleontology records did show that Carnotaurus was pretty big, but not that much bigger than an average 6-foot tall man. And so, the largest specimens, they were pretty large for what they were, but they definitely weren't much larger than most other dinosaurs. I mean, remember Jurassic Park? Disney's Dinosaur does similar inaccuracies, and it does seem that a good majority of other dinosaur-related media have done similar things. And it seems to be a tradition that carries on with loads of different criticisms in mind. Anyways, though, it isn't long, though. The Carnotaurus does seem to be on the winning side here. Its large size and intimidating appearance was more than enough to scare a majority of the dinosaurs, almost making them retreat backwards to where Kron was. Aladar, however, decides to stand up for himself, and upon unleashing noises at the Carnotaur while moving forward, the others eventually join on him. They decide to protest at the Carnotaur. It eventually becomes scared in its own way, backing down and away, until it sees Kron in the back, trying to climb over the cliffs. And once it does, it decides to go after him. Aladar, of course, does attempt to stop it. Carno is able to get to Kron, Aladar is able to get to the Carno, and eventually Nero is able to come around as well. It's a bit of a fight to the death, kind of like what Kron was trying to do. And while Kron himself was badly injured, Aladar and Nero thankfully are able to get that Carno out of there. And well, Carnotaur is eventually dropped off the other side of the cliff as the rocks collapse under its feet, causing him to fall to its death. For Kron, though, he unfortunately ain't so lucky. He ends up dying from his injuries in an attempt to get to the nesting grounds. Meanwhile, Aladar and Nira are thankfully safe from the harm that was these Carnotaurs. And then, the moment of truth comes through. The rest of the herd make it to paradise, just as Aladar had promised to them. By going through the valley and through the caves, they were actually able to make a safer advantage point into the breeding grounds themselves. And as such, it's a happy ending that carries onward to a whole new generation. In fact, there's a new group of lemurs that the family can have around. There are plenty of new dinosaur generations, including a bunch of new eggs. Even Aladar and Nira are able to have their own youth. And so, you could say that with new family and friends around to look out for each other, the new generation of dinosaurs in this paradise. It kind of is a lot like what Chicken Run had done. The fight to survival and the journey to paradise. Disney's Dinosaur does more or less the same thing, with Disney's perspective instead of DreamWorks or Aardman. And I will say that comparatively, while Dinosaur doesn't have that much of a cast and that much of a story to go along with, the usage of dinosaurs was a unique contrast. And also being that this was animated, more CG than the typical animation at the time, it sure was a nice piece worth looking back at. And 24 years later, I still do look at this as a memorable piece worth watching. And while it's not exactly a huge piece when it comes to dinosaur films, many more are actually way better. I mean, Jurassic Park, need I say more? Or Jurassic World if you want to get even better. But more on those films later. For Disney's Dinosaur though, it sure was big enough to not only give us a nice way of looking back at dinosaur related media, it even got itself a ride at Disney's Animal Kingdom. Originally called Countdown to Extinction, Disney's Dinosaur the Ride does have its own statue of Alidor in the front, and also features the Carnotaurus as the main antagonist, a rather hostile dinosaur that you encounter multiple times in the ride itself. And boy, is it incredible. They were in fact some of the best animatronics that Disney put together for theme park rides. And to this day, it is, believe it or not, still around. Knowing that Disney and Universal would shut down a lot of their rides to make room for newer attractions and newer paradises, franchises, names, etc. I mean, Animal Kingdom did supposedly get an Avatar ride not long before the sequel, Avatar: The Way of Water, came out. Otherwise, Disney's Dinosaur is still really good for what it is. Not great, but it's still enough to get a scoring, from me at least, a 7.7 out of 10.1. And I feel like that with all that I've said here, this marks the end of films I'm willing to talk about again. 68 episodes within a span of 6 months. That's a pretty good amount of time I put together, and a lot of content that was worth watching. The fact that some people have been able to call some attention to this season really goes to show that I'm more than willing to keep going at it with possibly more material for films I should have talked about years ago, or films I'm willing to talk about again. Maybe I could have a second season of TV shows that deserve the spotlight, or even, because in 2025 the queue for such content of this type doesn't really intend on starting until at least mid to late September of 2025, I feel like that to fill in the time, I could probably try something new. Maybe video games, maybe music, maybe books. Who really knows? There's probably a lot of things that are more than worth looking at. Anyways though, today on November 30th, 2024, I'm calling it. This is the end. Season 2 of films I'm willing to talk about again is pretty much over and done with. I'll probably have more of films I should have talked about years ago and films I'm willing to talk about again. Maybe more TV shows that deserve the spotlight, if I can get around to that. But otherwise, I will see you guys around pretty soon with other content. For the rest of the year, it's going to be pretty much gravy, with holiday related stuff coming up, lots of hard work put together, and a lot of money to earn in other ways possible. So, goodbye for now.
Usually get, and I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.